My name is Asha Knish, and I want to start off by taking you back into a childhood memory. 7 years ago, the morning of August 25th, was a sunlit, cloudless day. A promising notion considering that just a few hours earlier, the night sky was littered with downpour. And just a few hours earlier, a little girl stood staring out her bedroom window at the night sky, her gaze filled with worry about what the following day would mean. You see, this morning of August 25th was 7th grade orientation to a new school filled with new people in a new place. Perhaps against the little girl's wishes, the morning did end up arriving, and it was time for her to get ready and meet her new classmates. This was what she wanted. She had pushed and pushed to go to this new school. She had worked hard. And finally, after all those countless hours devoted to the application and the essays and the grades, it would all be worth it. She was sick of public school, and she wanted more challenge, more possibility. She wanted change. And finally, after begging and begging, this was her golden opportunity. But new opportunities and new changes were nonetheless a bit frightening. She would be attending boarding school, flying the coop at 12 years old. But she was determined to be independent. She was mature for her age. She was ready. And much to her mother's dismay, this little girl was stubborn. She nervously got ready, trying to look nice and dressed up for all these first impressions she would undoubtedly be making. This nervousness soon turned into excitement, though, and a few hours later, she found herself standing in front of her new middle school with her mom. Constructed back in the 1800s out of rigid stone, this school was like a portal into history. To a little girl's imagination, it was as if she was going to Hogwarts. It resembled entering the next chapter in her life. And although these next steps were paved with anxiety, it was exhilarating nonetheless. She soon found herself following the orientation signs that led into the school, smiling ear to ear up at her mom as they walked up the steps together. The signs split each grade level into different rooms. The little girl found her feet leading her down the hall into the room assigned for the 7th graders and corresponding teachers to meet. Moments later, she found herself with the name tag on, greeting other young, nervous faces. And then the small room of 16 kids was split into advisory groups. First up was a small-built, pretty teacher with blonde curls, who called out the names of 4 kids. They simultaneously got up and followed her out the door like baby chicks following the mom, with their parents at the end of the line. Next up was a burly, dark-haired man with a hockey coach stance. These predictions were found to be accurate as soon as he introduced himself as Coach P. Like the teacher before him, he announced the names of 3 kids, and then the little girl's name. Butterflies erupted in her stomach, but she diligently followed the crowd out the door, her mother close behind her. They congregated on wooden benches outside, breathing in the sunlit air and introducing themselves, where they were from, and the usual statements that take place during awkward introductory sessions. The girls' advisory group consisted of 2 boys who, like the girl, were from Minnesota, and another girl from South Korea, who introduced herself as Singwon Son, or Wendy, which was her American name. After the introductory sessions concluded, the group was free to get food, mingle, get to know each other. After everyone had headed towards the cafeteria, the little girl's mom urged her to go up to Wendy and her family and say hello. Her 7th grader self was incredibly opposed to the idea. Her mother tried using the line, "If you were going to school in a foreign country, wouldn't you want people to talk to you?" Wendy was talking to her parents in a language completely new to the little girl's ears. It blew her mind that the human mouth could make noises like that, which she later learned was the language of Korean. She didn't know anything about where Wendy came from, or even where her country was on a map. The little girl's 7th grader self was petrified of putting herself out there like that. But because Mama knows best, she mustered up the courage and went up to Wendy and her family. Now, you could probably tell that this little girl from the story was the 12-year-old version of myself. Years later, I'm not quite sure if my mother realizes the Pandora's box she's opened up in forcing me to say hello that day. Wendy later became my inseparable best friend, and our families became close confidants. The next year, when I was 13 years old, I traveled to South Korea to spend a chunk of my summer with Wendy and her family, and subsequently became immersed in all types of Asian culture. I contracted a severe case of the travel bug. Upon graduating boarding school in 12th grade, I was the only American living in the dorm. my friend group, nicknamed the United Nations, was made up of Koreans, Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Spanish, Mexicans, a Pakistani, and myself. As I've alluded to, diversity is very important to me. And in taking part in this trip with Thinking Beyond Borders, I valued it even more. This world is so full of colorful backgrounds, languages, and customs. I think many of us would agree that if we were all the same, it would be quite dull and boring. However, in having the vast diversity that this world does, conflict seems inevitable. When I see newspaper stories about countries clashing, I tend to cringe. I hear media stories justifying American drone strikes in Pakistan, and all I can think about is my best friend who lives in Pakistan with his family. I hear news about the United States conflicting with China, and I think of my Chinese friends and my amazing Chinese host family living in Kunming. For the past 7 years of my life, I've lived with people from these different countries and backgrounds, and I love them. They were my brothers, and they were my sisters. I don't want to see our countries fighting, and I don't want to see war waging between groups of people who I know have the potential to build amazing friendships and learn from each other. But hold up. There is a very important point I was not fully realizing before that I do need to get out there. This past year with TBB has been as much about experiencing externally as it has been about reflecting internally. And the point I realized was that I tend to reject American culture, even though I am technically American. In South Africa, our learning project was to shadow caregivers working in townships. Now, to dissect that a bit, caregivers are basically nurses, /confidants, /psychologists, /family, /teachers, /friends, who walk directly to patients' homes to care for them. The townships were small towns, largely populated by the colored or black community. Yes, coloreds and blacks are two different groups of people in South Africa. Don't quote me on this, but from my understanding, coloreds were mixed races and predominantly Afrikaans speaking. Blacks were one African race and predominantly Xhosa speaking in the region where we were in South Africa. Anyway, to travel to the township I worked in, I took the group taxi, which was basically a big van shuttle. Now, the apartheid was abolished nearly 20 years ago, but in my opinion, segregation is still very apparent. I never saw any other whites, except for those of us in TBB, take the taxis. So as I was saying, I hop in the taxi, and the next woman on sits next to me, and I start talking to her. She was a very kind-hearted, cheery, plump lady, full of energy and with a vivacious gospel tone of voice that gave me goosebumps. A man who was a store owner jumped in and plopped down next to us. I had seen him around the townships, and he recognized me, which is understandable because I tend to stand out as one of the only white people in the town. I noticed him studying me for a bit, and then after asking how I was today, he asked me if I was colored. Now, you may not realize how big of a deal this was for me. But this was one of the best compliments I have ever received. The rest of my TBB group did not hear the end of it, and swore it never happened because, let's be honest, I am an incredibly white person. How could anyone mistake me for being a colored person in South Africa? But you see, living at boarding school and traveling with TBB, I prided myself on being a cultural chameleon. I absolutely love being able to adapt and appreciate every culture I'm thrown into. I love being able to have homes all over the globe, and being able to travel to places and not be seen as a tourist, but as a local. The truth is that it's easy to tell everyone that we should accept and love one another, no matter where we are from, no matter what differing beliefs we hold, no matter the language we speak. But how can I preach if I can't even truly accept the culture I am from? It seems a bit hypocritical, doesn't it? In recognizing this vulnerability in myself, I wanted to dive deeper. Why do I tend to reject American culture, or at least not identify with it? Why do I internally cringe when I tell people I am from the USA? And why do I instantly see past negative stereotypes of other cultures, but look so intently at my own culture's stereotypes? Now, before I go into this, please don't get me wrong. I do see wonderful things within America. I see America as the birthplace of amazing ideas and inventions. I see America as harboring incredible medical remedies and intelligent professors. I see America as having made many advances in our society. But perhaps I'm scared about being defined as an American because I focus on the undesirable generalizations. When I think about American culture, I think of consumerism. Bigger is better, more is better. Live a successful life to own a big house and many expensive cars, no matter the environmental impacts. It's not a philosophy I agree with anymore. Going to the grocery store, you see signs like, buy a loaf of bread and get one half off. When I see signs like that, I automatically think, oh, a deal, a sale, cheap, let's buy. But do I really need more than one loaf of bread? If I were to take advantage of that deal, would the bread just go rotten before I could even eat it? Through living with my host family in Ecuador, I realized how little I truly need to live on, and how liberating living a simple life can be. I was so happy, no hair straightener, no problem. With less material objects comes less worry, which is an important philosophy I've discovered I absolutely agree with. Before coming on this trip, I felt that by having more stuff, I would be a happier person. I thought that buying and buying would release me from the trap of apathy I found myself in, surrounded by spoils. This is a bit shameful, but honestly, I have about 40 pairs of shoes at home. I've come to see that maybe that's where part of my anxiety stems from. I don't need 40 pairs of shoes. I can't use 40 pairs of shoes. And in discovering that I was trapped in the cycle of consumerism and materialistic values, I can truly appreciate living simply. So, if any women out there have size 7 feet and are looking for some new shoes, come talk to me afterwards. Coming back to America, I notice more than ever how much is consumed and many times wasted. And I notice how much more I use just being back in America. Now, of course, that's not to say that every American consumes, like the stereotype I have been describing. When I think a bit more about America, the foreign policy and foreign trade comes to mind. Traveling abroad, I feel as though I am an ambassador of my country, which I do believe is very true. If I act rude or obnoxious or drink or smoke, maybe other people will think of all Americans that way. In boarding school, I carried the same rationale, as I was representing America living in the dorm. And so maybe I was even more critical of what being American meant and trying to keep a good name for America. And you know, maybe it's just me. As a small child, I did struggle with self-confidence and accepting myself for who I am. Quite honestly, I struggled a lot with perfectionism and had high expectations of myself. So a possible segment that encompasses the issue of me rejecting Americanism is frankly me rejecting myself. Someone I dearly respect and look up to is Mahatma Gandhi. A quote of his that I found very relevant with my situation is, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Starting with myself, I can reflect on where I contradict my approach of universal acceptance and compassion. And perhaps after I have uncovered acceptance for myself and then acceptance for my culture, which I struggle with, maybe it will have a domino effect. Maybe not, but I definitely think it's worth a shot. A strong belief of mine is that understanding generates acceptance. And when I can understand someone, even if we may be very different from each other, I can develop an acceptance for them, a compassion for them. If we can understand where someone is coming from, whether it be differences in our beliefs, values, languages, customs, or what have you, we can come to love them. As a reiteration, I have come to realize that people can be so very different and diverse, and I've understood why this can lead to conflict and clashing. But through this discovery, I've also come to realize that fundamentally we do have unities. We all share the human experience, and we do have that common ground to come back to. I don't believe I am a naive person. I'm not saying that this world will ever truly see a utopia. I don't believe that. Every person in this room has a different vision of what an ideal world looks like. But I do believe that if I start with myself and learn to accept me for who I am and where I come from, I can start to accept everyone else and see the inner good in each person surrounding me, no matter how different or how similar they may be. I do see why there is conflict and hate and war in this world, but I also see why there doesn't have to be. America is, after all, a melting pot of all different cultures, languages, and people from every far-reaching corner of the globe. Maybe because I identify with being Korean and being Indian, and because I identify with certain Chinese ideals and certain Ecuadorian principles, and because I identify with values from South African culture, maybe that makes me American. Thank you. So I guess this is the question portion of the speech. Does anyone have